Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be reviewing Sandman Season 2. If you want to learn more of the story in the comics, I have covered all of the original Sandman series, including Overture as well, the prequel comic. I've also covered a lot of the DC Vertigo Dark series of books that tie in with the Sandman universe. So I've covered Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I've also covered Hellblazer up to Garth Ennis's run, and I'm currently going through the Mike Carey book Lucifer, which is a spin-off from Sandman, and I'm on volume 4. I'm going to be coming out with that next weekend. But yes, Sandman Season 2. So before I talk about Season 2, let me talk a little bit about Season 1 some more. So one thing with Season 1 is that I thought it was a pretty good adaptation, although I did express some of my frustrations with all of the race and gender swaps and how that annoyed me, how they weren't true to the comics with some of the casting choices. And I talked about that ad nauseum in my Season 1 review video. So if you want to see me talk about that some more, go watch that video again. But yes, some of those frustrations still continue onwards here. I would have liked John Constantine instead of Johanna Constantine, of course. I would have liked Lucifer to be a male. I would have liked various other casting choices, but for the most part, it's fine, I guess. But it still annoys me a little bit. Now, one thing really good about Season 1, though, once you get beyond some of those casting things, Season 1 adapted the first 2 trade paperbacks really thoroughly, and it really stayed true to the comic story, and I was so pleased about that. That was so great in Season 1. Fantastic stuff. Now, in Season 2 here, I don't know all the behind the scenes information, okay? The showrunners claim that they initially wanted to do 4 seasons, but then they kind of changed their story and said, oh no, we always just wanted to do 2 seasons because when you focus on just Dream's story, there's really only 2 seasons worth of content there. And I think that's a little bullshit. I think maybe the viewership wasn't high enough, but Netflix said, all right, you get one more season to wrap this stuff up. And they went with that. So Season 1 covered 2 trade paperbacks, and now Season 2 has to cover 8 trade paperbacks. And plus, they actually mix in Overture, the Sandman prequel comic, as well as Death, the High Cost of Living, which is a spin-off miniseries. So they're covering kind of like 10 trade paperbacks in one season. However, they're cutting stuff. They're cutting a lot of stuff. There's some trades they actually just completely ignore, or they cover maybe one issue in it. And, that's a little disappointing. Now, a lot of these Sandman trades, about 3 of them, are actually just a collection of short stories. And they're kind of unrelated to Dream sometimes. And I kind of get maybe why in Season 2 here, they decided to cut some of those stories. But it's disappointing a bit because some of those issues are really good and they help flesh out the Sandman universe. And, it's a bummer that they were cut. So let me dive into now some of the storylines that I really liked in the comic that unfortunately did not make it into Season 2. Okay, so like I said, there's 10 trade paperbacks. The first 2 were covered in Season 1, and Volume 3, which is just a collection of short stories. They covered some of those in Season 1 and a little bit in the Season 2 here. So for the most part, they covered most of that trade paperback. Volume 4 was covered. That is the storyline where Dream goes to hell and Lucifer abandons hell, and then Dream gets the key to hell and has to give it away. And I thought they adapted that really well. Then there's Volume 5, A Game of You, which was completely cut from Season 2, and it's never going to be adapted. And that trade paperback covered a character named Barbie and her whole story. And, I get the decision to cut that storyline because Dream is not in it, and it is quite a long story, and it kind of, we're covering completely different characters, and it would take several episodes to do that story justice. So I get that it was cut. It is not my favorite of the trades, but I kind of like the story a bit, and it's a little bit of a bummer. Then we had Volume 6, Fables and Reflections. This is a short story volume with a whole bunch of short stories, about 8 of them, and about 2 of these issues made it in and were adapted, and the other 6 were skipped. Of the 2 that made it in, there was the French Revolution story arc where Johanna Constantine goes to retrieve Orpheus's head, and then there was the Song of Orpheus. So those were very important issues, so it made sense they were adapted. but the rest were skipped. And some of the ones that were skipped, I really did like in the comics. So there's 3 Septembers in a January, all about this guy that wants to, or he imagines he is the Emperor of America and his dream of being that. And it was a really fun issue. And then there is the Eisner nominated issue, Ramadan, which was just fantastic. And I was really bummed that it was not adapted. So in Ramadan, it is set in Baghdad in the time of kind of Aladdin with magical carpets and a very beautiful Baghdad. And the king of Baghdad there, he wants the city of Baghdad to be ever immortalized the way it was then, with all the magical carpets and the fantasticalness of it. But the only way that city can be preserved is in dreams. And it does get preserved in dreams, but then the real Baghdad kind of becomes the war-torn place we see it is today. And it's a very beautiful issue, and bummed it wasn't adapted. There was Volume 7, that was fully adapted. That is where Dream into Delirium, Search for Destruction. So it was adapted, but it was abbreviated. There's Volume 8, World's End, which is another short story volume, and this entire trade paperback was skipped. I will say, though, it is my least favorite Sandman trade paperback. A lot of the short stories in this one do not work for me, so I get that they were cut. Although I still would have been interested in seeing the adaptation of some of them, such as Hob Leviathan, which is another Hob Gadling story, as well as The Golden Boy, all about this teenager, Prez Rickard, who becomes president of the United States. And it's a very wacky story, and I would have loved to see it adapted, but I get cutting it. Volume 9, The Kindly Ones, and Volume 10, The Wake, they were adapted, or they were very abbreviated. A couple things were cut, a couple plot points were changed, but for the most part, it was adapted. One of the weird choices they made was that Johanna Constantine had a kind of romantic relationship with the Corinthian 2 in the TV show, which was not present at all in the comics. And I didn't really love that change. One issue that was cut that I really liked in the comics was an epilogue called Sunday Morning, all about kind of the send-off for Hob Gadling and giving that character an ending in a way. And that was skipped in the TV show, which was disappointing. Now, one thing that was kind of a bonus is that they took a little bit of the Overture Sandman prequel comic, which they did not adapt the story in that, which is a very wild, crazy story. But in that trade, they did introduce Dream's parents, Night and Time. And at least they took those characters and kind of brought them into the TV show at another point in time. So we got to see some of those moments, which I did like. It was a nice little Easter egg. The show also adapted Death, The High Cost of Living, which is a Death spin-off miniseries. And I was not expecting them to adapt that, and it was kind of nice that they did. All right, so I kind of broke down all the trade paperbacks and what made it in and what didn't. Speaking more broadly, it's almost impossible to break down all of the little changes and tweaks and cuts that they did to adapt the comic into the TV show. There's just so many other little things out there. You know, Hob Gadling's story was abbreviated. Thessaly was cut. A whole bunch of stuff was just tweaked and whatnot. But for the most part, if you had to tell the rest of the Sandman story in one season, they did, for the most part, the best job they could. So I guess I am satisfied enough with what they did. Now, I would have loved one more season to really do the story justice, but for what they had to do, they kind of made it work. And the show, you know, it still looked good. It was compelling and entertaining, and the actors were good. So I'm somewhat pleased, although I'm not as high on it as I was in season 1, but still, I thought it was enjoyable and a success. So I'm going to give season 2 of Sandman an 8 out of 10. Thank you all for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to check out a lot of my Sandman coverage of the comics and the spin-off series.